I I really hope that someday, maybe hopefully next year, I get to actually invite you to Nigeria for a conversation, honestly, because I had a conversation with a professor about your work yesterday, and it was just like it doesn't get it. It does it doesn't get it how any of it actually connects. And yeah, I was pretty detailed. But it just doesn't see how your work actually connects with tribalism in Nigeria.
Oh,
Tribal, yeah. So,
well,
hmm,
I think I would be honored to be able to come and exchange ideas
hmm,
with professors in Nigeria because I must confess that this morning, when I was looking over the questions that you sent me and realizing how ignorant I am about Africa in general and Nigeria in particular. And I spent the last few hours just reading a bit about the history of Nigeria. And the first thing that I wondered is whether or not our ideas are applicable. I do think that they are,
hmm,
but that would be best decided, in a respectful conversation
yeah.
between myself and other scholars. But
Hmm,
I would be very happy
hmm.
uh, to exchange ideas with folks in Nigeria.
Yeah, I have been studying your work for about 2 years or 3 years, I think. 2 years, and I'm very certain they are applicable to the present situation in the country.
Ah, good.
Yeah. So I'll start by asking the first question on the list. As it relates to your work, what distinguishes humans from other animals?
Yes, that's a very, I think, fine question to begin any discussion to understand what makes people the way that we are.
Mm,
And the work that I do was influenced primarily by a cultural anthropologist, a scholar named Ernest Becker, who died in the 1970s. But he his work started by saying, well, what is it that distinguishes us from other creatures? But what he said is that we need to think about it with two different questions at the same time. How are we the same as other animals? And how are we distinctly and uniquely
mm,
different? And here he uses Charles Darwin, the theory of evolution. And what Darwin said is, look, in many ways, we're not that different from other animals. We're not even that different from like plants. In that, like all living things, we are the products of billions of years of evolution to be biologically predisposed towards self-preservation in the service of survival and reproduction. So, in that sense, as Darwin put it, the
mm,
living things like to stay alive. He called it the struggle for survival. And so, in some ways, we are exactly the same as other animals. On the other hand, what makes us very different is the specific way that we are able to not only survive, but to prosper. And this gets back to Darwin. He's
mm,
like, okay, well, sharks have sharp teeth, and giraffes have long necks, and turtles have hard shells. And so that just shifts the question to, well, what about people? And Darwin was the first to notice that in some ways we're a bit of a paradox because compared to other animals, we're not very big, we're not very strong, our teeth aren't that sharp, our eyesight's not that good, we can't smell that well. And we do have a couple of good things going for us physically, upright bipedalism and our eyesight. We've got opposable thumbs. But the fact is that most of us wouldn't be able to make it until sundown if we had to survive just simply by ourselves. But we got two things going for us. And one is that we can't and don't survive by ourselves. We're fundamentally social creatures, and that makes us able to cooperate to construct and maintain a host of elaborate institutions that facilitate our collective survival. So that's thing number one, is that we're really highly social creatures, but so are bees and ants, and so there's got to be more to it. And that brings us to the second point, and that is that we are very intelligent creatures. We've got a big forebrain, and that allows us to think abstractly and symbolically to the point where only humans, as far as we can tell, can imagine things that don't even exist and then go on to have the audacity to make them real.
Mm,
And I like one of Freud's disciples, a guy named Otto Rank, a disciple at first, and
yeah.
then went on to do his own work. And his quote is that humans make the unreal real. So I guess that's my long-winded answer to your
Mm,
very fine question. We
mm,
are biological entities that are designed to survive, but the way that we do that is very special. Every other creature has to accept the world in the form in which they encounter it. Only people at our best can modify the world around us to make it better.
mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You said your work actually started with an attempt to understand why humans actually disagree, why we disagree with people who share different beliefs on the nature of reality. Yeah, that was how you said. So how does that connect itself?
Oh, okay. So again, that's a very good question. So what Ernest Becker goes on to say is, we're so smart that we actually realize that we're here. And this is an idea that he gets from the existential philosopher Soren Kierkegaard.
Mm,
And these days in psychology, they call it self-awareness or self-consciousness, but this was in the 1840s. And basically, Kierkegaard said that we're the only living creatures that know that we're here, that a raccoon is here but doesn't know it. A banana's here but doesn't know it. But every neurologically intact human being gets to a point where you wake up one day and you realize that you're here. And that's how psychologists would generally define the notion of self, that it's just the way that you understand yourself at any particular moment. All right, well, so what? And here's where Kierkegaard made some important contributions to psychology before there was even such thing as psychology, because he said, look, what happens is that if we're smart enough to know that we're here, according to Kierkegaard at least, that means that we necessarily, he claims, experience two different uniquely human emotions. And he called those emotions awe and dread. And so let's do the good news first.
mm,
Kierkegaard
yeah.
said, you know what? It's awesome to be alive and to know it. That on our best days, we can wake up and just be extraordinarily joyous about the fact that we're here. It's not that we have millions of dollars. It's not that I won an Olympic gold medal
Mm,
or a Nobel Prize.
mm,
I'm just uplifted by the prospect of my existence. And I say that to remind myself that it's great to be alive. Well, but on the other hand, Kierkegaard turned right around and he said, yeah, but it's also dreadful. If you're not a baby or an idiot, if you're smart enough to know that you're here, you're also smart enough to know that, like all living things, your life is a finite duration
mm.
and that you too will someday die. And I'm going to repeat that because that's kind of the major point
Yeah, the major points, yeah.
of the work that we do, which
Mm,
is that one unanticipated byproduct of our vast intelligence is the realization of the inevitability of death. And what Ernest Becker claimed is that that simple fact that we're going to die and that we know it, and that we know it long before it's likely to happen, even when our lives are not threatened, that
mm,
that has literally altered the trajectory of human evolution. And it's not only that we realize that we're going to die someday, we also realize that we could die at any time for reasons that we're unable to anticipate or control. And so what Ernest Becker claimed is that, you know, if that's the only thing that we thought about when we wake up in the morning, I'm going to die someday, or I could be waking up and get killed in a hurricane or a tornado, or I could be at a wedding or a funeral,
mm.
as I read in the paper yesterday about a suicide bombing in
Yeah, in
Nigeria.
Nigeria, yeah.
In other words, every day it is literally possible to be summarily obliterated and permanently removed from the world as we each know it. And for Ernest Becker, those realizations would create just paralyzing waves of debilitating existential terror. To be silly, you just wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning if
Mm,
that's all you thought about.
mm,
And so, what Becker proposed is that we human beings manage existential terror by constructing and embracing what he called cultural worldviews,
yeah.
that humanly created beliefs about reality that we share with other people in our culture, and that reduces death anxiety by giving us each a sense that life has meaning and we have value. And so, meaning and value are really key to this kind of existential conception of the motivational underpinnings of human behavior.
Mm,
Becker says, look, every culture tells us how we got here, what we're supposed to do while we're here,
mm,
and what happens to us after we die. Every culture has an account of the origin of the universe. Every culture has a list of ethical prescriptions that, if we subscribe to, offer us the possibility of immortality, be it religious in the form
mm,
of heavens or afterlives,
yeah.
or it could be symbolic. I could just make a boatload of money and put my name on buildings and airplanes, or I could create a great work of art or science that'll
Mm,
be remembered
mm,
long after I'm not here. And so the point for Becker and for the work that I do with my
mm,
buddies is
mm,
that whether we know it or not,
mm,
our primary motivation at all times, and by the way, we mostly don't, almost all of this happens quite unconsciously,
mm,
but our primary motive at any given moment is to maintain confidence in our beliefs about the nature of reality, as well as faith in our value as individuals. And that's what Becker calls self-esteem, the belief that we're persons of value in a world of meaning. Okay, well, this gets back to your question now, and it
yeah.
is one of the most important ones that I can imagine. And that's how come, since almost day one of human history, why can't we get along with other people who do not share our beliefs
mm,
about the nature of reality? Why has history been one long succession of genocidal atrocities that are juxtaposed with the brutal subjugation of people inside the culture that we designate as inferior? And um, and so uh, let's not be too simple-minded, because like any complex thing that we're trying to understand, I don't think that there's necessarily one explanation.
mm,
And clearly, there's substantial evidence that a significant proportion of human conflict
mm,
has a lot to do with the possession and acquisition of the material resources
mm,
necessary to survive. And so
yeah,
let's not in any way dismiss that,
mm,
because I do believe that that happens to be the case. But it's got to be more than that, because these kinds of psychological uh, dilemmas that end up contributing to long-term conflicts that yield unnecessary and heinous violence, also, Becker would argue, and our research would suggest that he's right, that there's a psychological dimension. And it's actually very simple. If my beliefs about reality help to reduce death anxiety, well, then when I run into somebody who has very different beliefs, then I have a psychological problem, whether I'm aware of it or not. And that is that if I accept and respect somebody else's beliefs about reality, I almost always do so at the expense of the confidence with which I subscribe to my own. So
yeah,
if I come from the Judeo-Christian tradition and believe that God created the earth in 6 days, and then I run into folks from the Fulani tribe who believe that, I think that they believe the earth was created out of a giant drop of milk.
mm,
Well, and these are each equally beautiful accounts of the
mm,
origin of everything.
yeah,
Right, but if the Fulani are right about the earth being created out of a giant drop of milk, well, then the fundamentalist view of the Judeo-Christian worldview that the earth was created in 6 days, well, that's got to be factually incorrect. And Becker's point, therefore, is that the very existence of people who are different
mm,
causes existential anxieties, because it undermines the confidence in our own beliefs, and that exposes us to the same existential anxieties
mm,
that those beliefs were erected to reduce in the first place. And
mm,
so, what happens when we run into people who are different? Well, according to Becker, one thing that we do is to diminish, dehumanize, and disparage them. We're just
mm,
like, oh, those people are stupid. If they, the Fulani believe the earth was created out of a drop of milk, but those are ignorant Africans living in grass huts, worshiping piles of sticks and mud. I'm being
mm.
silly here. I'm
Yeah,
not
I
meaning
understand. I understand.
but that's one way to diminish the threat that alternative belief systems pose. That's just to dismiss the people who embrace them. Well, at the same time, we try to get those people to dispose of their ideas and
Mm,
to adopt ours instead. That's what the Christian missionaries did in Africa.
mm,
There were cultures that were thriving for thousands of years. They
yeah,
came in and they just say, "Hey, you're all Catholic now. Let's play bingo." And
mm,
if that doesn't work, just kill the people that are different,
mm,
thus proving that your God
mm,
and your beliefs are superior after all.
mm,
And uh, so, according to Ernest Becker,
mm,
the largest explanation
mm,
for our inability to peacefully coexist with those who have different beliefs is that it undermines our capacity to deny our own mortality by weakening our culturally constructed belief systems.
mm. Yeah, so I looked through some of your studies that you mentioned, and the one that stood out to me the most was the people when shown passages of the Bible that are inconsistent actually brings their thoughts to mind. I
Yes. So that's actually a nice point. So that's one way that we have shown experimentally, just to back up a bit for the
mm,
folks that are unfamiliar with our work.
yeah,
A lot of people, when Ernest Becker, he won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Denial of Death. And this was in the 1970s. And what a lot of scholars and professors said was, well, this is interesting, but it's just speculative. We don't know if it's true or not. A lot of psychologists said, well, I don't think about death all the time, so it must be nonsense. And so this is where we come in. My training is in experimental social psychology, and my buddies from graduate school, Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski, also experimental social psychologists. So that's what we've been doing for the last 40 years. And there's now
mm,
several thousand experiments by our colleagues as well as other independent scholars uh, that basically show two things. One is that when we remind people that they're going to die, they cling more tenaciously to their culturally constructed beliefs and to their self-esteem. And we can talk about some of that work.
mm,
And then the other research is, as you suggested, and that
mm,
is that when we threaten people's cherished beliefs or their self-esteem, that makes thoughts of death come more readily to mind. So just as you put it, so when religious people are shown passages in the Bible that just can't be right, because if you read the story of Genesis, there's one place where God created Adam, and then Eve was created from one of
mm,
Adam's ribs.
mm.
There's another chapter in Genesis where God created Adam and Eve independently. They
Yeah,
can't both be true. And so when a fundamentalist who's taught that the Bible is literally true are shown those logical inconsistencies, well, that makes death thoughts come more readily to mind. But this is not just about politics,
yeah,
because when Canadians, for example, read an article criticizing Canada, well, then their death thoughts come more readily to mind. When students in America are asked to think about the possibility that they're not going to be able to get a job that will make them successful when they're done with college or university, that makes their death thoughts come more readily to mind. So
mm,
even atheists who say that there's no God, if you show them like an article from a Harvard archaeologist saying that Jesus may actually have been alive, that makes death thoughts come more readily to mind. And
mm,
so, what this suggests is a point that Ernest Becker was very much adamant about, and that is that all cultural worldviews, if they religious or secular or atheist, they are all to a certain degree death denying visions of reality.
mm,
But let's go the other way just for a second and talk a little bit about what happens when we remind people that they're going to die. So sometimes we just bring people into our lab and they're filling out questionnaires. And then one of the questions is just write down your thoughts and feelings about the fact that you're going to die. Other times we do this work outside of the lab. We stop people either right in front of a funeral parlor or 100 meters to either side. And our thought is that if you're standing in front of a funeral parlor, that death is on your mind, even if you're not aware of that fact. And then we have another paradigm where we bring people into the lab and they read stuff on a computer screen. And while they're doing that, we flash the word death for like 28 milliseconds. It's so fast that you don't even know that you've seen anything. And this is important because death can be on your mind all the time, but you don't need to necessarily know that it's there. All right, well, let's get back to why people can't get along with other folks who are different, because this was what Tom and Jeff and I were trying to understand 50 years ago. And so in one of our first experiments, we had Christian participants who were either reminded that they were going to die or something unpleasant but not fatal. And then we asked them to evaluate other participants who happened to be either Christian or Jewish. And the good news is that the Christians in our studies, they liked other people regardless of their religion just as much in a control condition. So they didn't discriminate between Jewish people and Christians under benign psychological conditions. On the other hand, after being reminded that they were going to die, Christians now liked fellow Christians a lot more, and they liked Jewish people a lot less. And what's important is that this has nothing to do with Judaism or Christianity. In Israel, Jewish people reminded that they're going to die. They like Jewish people more, and they hate Arabs and Christians. And that basic finding that when you're less, that's been reproduced in more than 25 countries on 3 or 4 different continents. And so there's evidence that this is fairly universal. And it's not only about attitudes. So Germans reminded that they're going to die. They sit closer to people who look German, and they sit further away from people who look like Turkish immigrants. And it also influences our willingness to aggress against people who are different. Iranians who are reminded that they're going to die, they are more supportive of suicide bombing, and they're more willing to become suicide bombers, which should be scary for anybody. In the United States, when Americans are reminded that they're going to die, if they identify as politically conservative, well, they are more supportive of using nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons against countries who do not threaten us directly. And so, based on that evidence, the point that we have been making for years is that existential anxieties contribute to our hostility and disdain for people who are different. And again, just to be sure that we're not reduced to simple-mindedness, I don't think that that's the only explanation for why we can't get along with other people. But if we don't consider the role of death anxiety in prejudice and violence, be it domestic or foreign, then I think we will never be able to have a comprehensive understanding about why it's so prevalent and persistent.
So in light of your work, how does moral differences, how does it factor into this, how does moral differences factor into this? Because in Nigeria, the stark difference in the southern part and the northern part is this moral difference, you know? How does it factor into this?
Well, I think it's actually central that what it really comes down to ultimately are cultural differences in what constitutes right and wrong. And this gets back to why I think it's kind of complicated because cultures are not only belief systems that serve to minimize existential anxiety, that
Mm,
they're also extraordinarily valuable, concentrated knowledge and expertise that we have accumulated over thousands of years and that we pass on
mm,
to future generations. And
mm,
so, for example, one argument is that cultures that practice polygamy, where a man may have more than one wife,
mm,
that those tend to have evolved in agrarian circumstances
mm,
where having more children
mm.
was useful for staying alive.
Yeah.
There are other cultures where the argument is that material conditions were such that it fostered more monogamous social relations.
Yeah.
Uh, so basically, so you have one culture that says, oh, it's fine to have more than one wife. You have another culture that says, no, that's not good.
Mm,
And so the important point from a biological perspective is there may be actual material reasons why those different values
mm,
are each useful and adaptive, at least in the original environment
mm,
that they were generated in.
mm,
And so the morals are central to any group of social creatures because it is the basis upon which we can cooperate and collaborate. And so I
mm,
don't think it should surprise us that a lot of enduring conflicts come down to conflicts in values. On
mm,
the other hand, it's still the case that most religions share the superordinate value of the golden rule, and that's to basically treat others as you would like to be treated yourself, at
mm,
least others that are members of our own culture.
mm, mm, mm. So, how do one deal with death anxiety? This anxiety. How can one deal with it?
Yes, okay. Now, that's a great question. To be silly, if I could answer that question um, intelligently and effectively, then I should get a Nobel Prize
Mhm,
because
mhm,
I think the Albert Camus, the existential writer,
mm,
he said, "Come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible."
mm,
And I think that if the ideas that we have been talking about today are valid, and again, I'm a bit biased, but I think that they are. We have evidence that reminders of death influence, just about everything that people do. We already talked about when you're reminded that you're going to die, you hate and hurt people that are different. When
mm,
you are reminded that you're going to die, you're more apt to support fascist
mm,
leaders.
mm.
Like right now, Earth is in a terrible shape right now as
Yeah.
democracies are being voted out of office and replaced by fascist dictatorships. And sure enough, when we remind people that they're going to die,
mm,
uh, that substantially increases their devotion to and support for fascist politicians. When we
mm,
remind people that they're going to die, they don't like the fact that we're animals, and they become very terrible in their treatment of other animals. When
mm,
we remind people that they're going to die, they become absurd and obscene in their desire to have endless amounts of money and more stuff,
mm,
even if it ruins the natural environment without which we'd be unable to make it through lunch. When we
mm,
remind people that they're going to die, it magnifies all pre-existing psychological conditions. So if you're depressed and you're reminded that you're going to die, you become more depressed. If you're anxious, more
mm,
anxious. If you're
mm,
obsessed, more obsessed. All
mm.
right, so back to your great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, what ought we do about it? All right, well, one point that Becker makes is that one thing that we should do is to look at the values that we subscribe to in our culture to see if they're realistically attainable for the average individual. So, for example, in America right now, in order to feel good about yourself, you have to be the best at whatever you do. So if you have a lot of money, you got to have the most money, or you're a loser.
Mm,
If you're an athlete, you have to be the best, or you're a loser. If you're a woman, you have to be very attractive and very young, or you're a loser. And the point that these guys make is that that's a recipe for psychological disaster, because the average person in the United States right now is a dismal failure, because only one person can be the best at what they do.
mm,
And so, one way that people suggest that we collectively work to manage death anxiety is to re examine our cultural values
mm,
to see if they're realistically attainable.
mm,
One of the points that Becker makes, he's like, I'm not trying to be naive, but Christianity in the Middle Ages was actually a promising worldview, because what Christians were told is that you don't need to be rich or beautiful to get to heaven. You
mm,
just have to be a decent human, and that's
mm,
at least possible.
mm,
So I would say that that's one way to mitigate or to reduce death anxiety, is to modify the cultural beliefs
mm.
that we subscribe to. Now, that's easily more easily said than done.
Yeah.
And so in our work, we're like, okay, that's one way. But while that's happening, we need to work on some other ways. Um, and so in this regard, there's a group of psychologists, it's called positive psychology in North America these
Mm,
days. And they have been demonstrating that they talk about three constructs: awe, awe, what is it? Awe, gratitude, and humility. And
mm,
so they're like, and this gets back to Kierkegaard. Remember how Kierkegaard said it is awesome
mm.
to be alive
Yeah.
and to know it. And so there are researchers who point out that awe is a natural state that we can induce by just reminding people how great it is to be alive. And so awe is typically defined as just the realization that the universe is infinitely vast and will always be beyond our understanding, but in a good way, that there will always be something to strive towards. And Heidegger, the German philosopher, he thought that that was good, that at our best, we are always looking forward to something happening. He called it anticipatory resoluteness.
Mm,
And so it gets back to it's awesome to be alive. And sure enough, in studies where people are given an opportunity to apprehend how awesome it is to be alive, that just being in a state of awe reduces defensive reactions to death reminders.
mm,
So too does the idea of humility, all right, which is not the same as self-deprecation. So
mm,
again, here in the United States, when I say the word humble, a lot of the students think that that's a bad thing, that it means that you're tiny or just small. And that unfortunately misses the point, because in existential terms, to be humble is to just realize your position in the universe. And the fact of the matter is that we are all born in a time and place not of our choosing. We're in a body that we didn't choose. I could have been, I'm a professor born in New York in a male body.
mm,
Well, I could have been born a female in Mongolia 1,000 years ago as a goat herder, or even a goat for that matter.
mm,
And whether I like it or not, I am who I am. I'm here and now. I will be here for an infinitesimally small amount of time before my body dies, and the atoms that make up my body
mm,
are returned to the cosmos from which they were initially derived.
mm,
And what psychologists on my side of Earth, they call it cosmic insignificance. They're like, hey, you really are quite humble in the overall scheme of things. All right, but here's what's interesting. When you tell some people you're a little speck of dust and you're not going to be here long, it makes
mm,
them feel miserable.
mm,
But but other people, if you say the same thing, it actually makes them feel better. And what studies are beginning to show is that humility is just a sense that we really are relatively minor players in the overall scheme of things. On the other hand, we are directly connected to everyone and everything. And so I'm alive, and that means I'm a descendant of the first thing that ever lived. It means
mm,
I'm related somewhat to everything that's ever been alive, and I will continue to be related to everything that's alive when I'm no longer here. All right, so to get back to the point about humility,
yeah.
that also, when we just remind people of where they actually stand in the universe, which is a relatively inconsequential speck of transient, respiring, carbon-based dust, that's actually existentially comforting, as long as we remember that we're connected to everyone and everything. And sure enough, in studies where people are put in a state of humility, that also reduces defensive reactions to death reminders. And then finally, being grateful has remarkable effects in terms of reducing death anxiety. And my point to anybody who happens to be listening to us today or
Mm,
whenever they hear us is that
yeah.
any one of us, if we slept in a bed last night, if we had breakfast today, we have a lot to be grateful for. And so I see, I see awe, gratitude, and humility as tremendously important. And then one more thing, while we're just musing about these matters, and
Mm,
that is that ultimately, I think that if we're gonna ever make headway,
mm,
and that the future of humanity, not to overstate this, may really depend on this last point, and that is that we're going to have to, at some point, recognize that we as human beings, that we're in this world together,
Mm,
that every human being on earth, as far as we know, originated in a single community in southeastern Africa, and that we have a lot more in common as human beings than we are different. And so there's a study that I think is really important that uses what's called a common humanity prime.
mm,
People are brought into the lab and they're told what I just said, that people have more in common than we are different. And that has the advantage of being factually correct. We humans have a remarkably small genetic variation. Any two humans on Earth are more closely related genetically than two monkeys sitting next to each other on a hill in Africa. And what's important about that is when we're reminded that we have more in common with each other than we
mm,
are different, when we're reminded that we're going to die, we don't hurt and harm
mm,
people who are different.
mm,
And, so I like how Abraham Lincoln put it,
mm.
during the Civil War in America. Here were the South and the North
Yeah.
killing each other,
Mm,
essentially trying to get rid of slavery would be one large element of the war.
mm,
And, here was Lincoln in his inaugural address. He said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection."
mm,
And for me, and it may sound naive,
mm.
uh, but ultimately, I think that coming to terms with the reality of the human condition uh, is also going to require that as cultural constructions, we can each step back and ponder the need to establish a fundamental sense of connection to our fellow humans.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That was what I discussed with this professor yesterday about tribalism in Nigeria and how it might be a necessity to dispose of some of our supernatural beliefs that defines us as being uniquely different from each
Yes.
other, and actually adopting a more naturalistic explanation that bonds us, that creates the unity we need in Nigeria.
Yes, I like that idea, and I think you're on the right track.
Yeah. So, in the light of all this, how would you define the self? Is the self a thing? Is the self real? Many people talk about the self, but is that something like the self?
Ooh, again, these are great questions, and thank you for your thoughtful inquiry here. This honestly, this will depend on who uh, who's responding to the question. So as I mentioned earlier, in traditional psychological discourse,
Mm,
the self is described as just an internal mental representation of who we are and what we're doing. And in psychological discourse, what professors or scholars say these days is that usually we think of ourselves in two different ways simultaneously.
mm,
One is in terms of traits. So people will be like, "Hey, tell me about yourself," and you'll be like, "Well, I'm friendly and thoughtful, and so on." So that's one way to describe ourselves, is in terms of a variety of traits. Another way is in terms of what's called narrative accounts. We are, as human beings, fundamentally storytelling creatures.
mm,
And so when you meet somebody and you are learning about them, sometimes you learn about them in terms of their traits. Other times you learn about them in terms of their life story.
mm,
And then what the psychologists of today argue is that the notion of self is that there's other dimensions, that at any given time we have our self-image, and that's what do we think of ourselves
mm,
now.
mm,
And then there's an ideal self, which is, well, what is it that we would really like to be?
mm,
And if we think about the self in those terms, then basically the discrepancy between how you see yourself now and how you would ideally like to be, that's usually an indication of dissatisfaction. So this is
mm,
just common sense masquerading as psychological insight.
mm,
You know, if I think of myself as pretty close to how I would like to be, then I'm generally pretty happy. But
mm,
the greater the discrepancy, the higher the misery. And
mm,
then finally, self is the basis of self-esteem,
mm,
that it is always a value-laden judgment
mm,
where our self-concept is tainted is the wrong word because that has negative connotations, but our self-concept is always a complicated mosaic of how we think about ourselves as opposed to how other people think about ourselves. So that's one view of the self, that it sounds kind of stable, that we've got these, these internal representations. But what a lot of other folks say is, yeah, I think that may be a little bit too rigid and structural. William James, who wrote the first book about psychology, Principles of Psychology, in the 1880s or 90s, I believe, he had a take on the self that, in retrospect, is kind of almost Buddhist in nature,
mm,
because William James saw the self as just kind of a dynamic, it's like floating down
mm,
a stream. It's just that it's basically the coagulation of thoughts and feelings
mm,
that we possess at any particular moment in time.
mm,
And that's kind of moving us towards the Buddhist conception of
mm,
self,
mm,
which is that it's just an unfortunate mental defense against prevailing anxieties that if we were able to overcome, we would then be more directly connected to reality directly. And
mm,
that's why in Eastern thought, the goal is to dispose of the self,
mm,
whereas in Western thought, the goal is to cultivate a self-image that
mm,
allows us to be free and flexible
mm,
at the same time.
mm. This is my last question. It's, what do you think, at least existentially, what do you think is the difference between political conservatism and liberalism?
Wow, another great question. So basically, this is another one of these um, it, multi-dimensional questions. So
Mm,
for sure. So one thing that we know, this is just based on our studies, is
mm,
that uh, conservative folks, based on our studies and other studies,
mm,
and these are not judgments, by the way. These are just declarative statements.
mm,
It turns out that the word liberal means tolerant and open-minded,
mm,
and the people who describe themselves as liberal are much more open to other folks who are different.
mm,
People who define themselves as conservative
mm,
They have higher death anxiety,
mm,
and they, by their own admission, are less welcoming and tolerant of
mm.
people who are different.
Yeah.
And so, sure enough, when conservatives are reminded that they're going to die, they become more hateful and hostile to people who are different.
Mm,
When liberals are reminded that they're going to die, they actually like people who are different more.
mm.
All right. Now, you might hear that and you're like, oh, wait a minute, that means I'm a better person
Yeah.
if I'm liberal rather than conservative.
Conservative. Yeah.
And I think that is that's an unfortunate way to look at things. And so, if I don't keel over, I'd like to write something in the next couple of years based on talks that I now do
Mm.
called "Why Left and Right Are Both
Well,
Beside the
the
Point,"
point. Yeah.
because in a lot of cultures these days, my own in the United States, it's like a football match. It's like you got the conservatives on one team,
Mm,
the liberals on the other, and it's like, well, who's better? And it's almost like, if the conservatives are winning, that means that the liberals are worthless and have
mm,
nothing to offer.
mm,
But here's the problem with that. Political orientation is in large measure genetically determined. What I mean by that, I'm not saying there's a gene for being liberal or conservative, but the heritability quotient of political orientation is very high. It's like zero point 0.4 or zero point 0.5.
mm.
English translation, if you're a conservative person and you were born with an identical twin who you never knew and was separated at birth and raised in a completely different culture, if you're conservative, chances are good that your twin is going to be conservative. Same thing for liberal. And if you think about it for a moment, what that suggests is that both traits have some adaptive value.
Mm,
And there's a scholar who I respect very much, an Israeli psychologist, Gilad Hirschberger, and his colleagues, and they have written about and done research demonstrating that in an ideal culture, that there would be a symbiotic relationship, a stable equilibrium
yeah.
of both conservative as well as liberal individuals.
Mm,
And what Gilad and his colleagues have shown is that that folks who are conservative, they tend to be aware of and more accurate in detecting external threats.
mm,
Whereas people who are liberal, they tend to be better at recognizing and negotiating the resolutions of internal conflicts.
mm,
And so the general point is that any society that's too conservative is doomed, because then you tend to be racists and xenophobic serial killers
mm,
who want to destroy anybody who's even remotely different.
mm,
And if we were all conservative, we'd all be sitting on the floor of a cave. Nothing would ever change because
mm,
they resist change.
mm,
On the other hand, if we were all liberal, we'd all be dead. We'd be
mm.
insensitive to genuine external
External
threats.
literature.
That's correct. And we'd be so receptive to change that we wouldn't adequately value aspects of our culture that ought to be retained.
Mm,
And so, my current view of things is that, yeah, we need to even here become more aware of the virtues of conservative as well as liberal political philosophy.
mm,
Actually, to put it another way, I find both liberal and conservative political philosophy to be intellectually and morally bankrupt because they each are based on misunderstandings about human nature. I think we are at our best, like I said, not to be repetitive,
mm,
when we have a nice combination of folks who vary along the continuum.
mm, mm. All right. I have one more question. It is about multiculturalism in America. Has America always been multicultural, or do you think there has always been a dominant culture, or and how has this been handled?
Yeah, so another great question. We are a multicultural society in principle, but I would argue not in practice.
Mm,
We are supposedly a secular melting pot
mm,
where people came to North America,
mm,
forgetting about the fact that it was already inhabited and that, you know, America was founded by genocide built on the backs of slaves. Can't
mm,
ignore that.
mm,
But we also should not ignore that at our best, America is supposedly the land of the free and the
mm,
home of the brave, the
mm.
Statue of Liberty. You know, they're like, give me, you're tired
You're poor.
and you're poor.
Mm,
In principle, the American dream is such that anybody who's willing to work hard enough
mm,
has the possibility of being immensely successful.
mm,
And so, in some ways, and I am in some ways a good example of America as a truly multicultural
mm,
society, in
mm,
that my grandparents came here as peasants from Eastern Europe,
mm,
Russia,
mm,
and Austria.
mm,
My father worked two full-time jobs
mm,
when I was a child. And when I asked him, Daddy, why are you doing that? Why? I never see you. You're always working. He said, I'm doing that so you won't have to work
mm,
two full-time jobs.
mm,
Well, I grew up working in restaurants. I worked full-time for the most part when I was in university.
mm,
And yet, my life has been amazing. My biggest problem every day is not, am I going to eat, but it's, what do I feel like eating?
mm,
And my children have benefited. We're not wealthy people,
mm,
but we certainly have the benefits of knowing that we are fairly economically well-to-do. All right,
mm,
so that's like the good news. It's like a fairy tale. On the other hand, America has always, at the same time, been a white Christian nationalist, proto-fascist, not
mm,
multicultural
mm,
society, starting with the annihilation of the indigenous natives, the
mm,
hundreds of years of unconscionable enslavement
mm,
of people in color, the
mm,
fact that the Reconstruction after the Civil War was used by Hitler as his basis for eugenics and his Holocaust-like inclinations.
mm,
Um, in other words, we have, at the same time that we purport to be a multicultural society, are now becoming more and more a blatantly racist
mm,
and unfortunately economic and religiously and politically
mm,
and stratified culture,
mm.
um, on the brink, frankly, of a complete breakdown. This is a story for another time.
Yeah.
There's a guy named Peter Turchin, I believe that's his name, who wrote a book called End Times,
Mm,
and he's basically a mathematical biologist who looks at income inequality and predicts with relatively good accuracy when societies are about to collapse, when income inequality gets to a certain point. And
Mm,
I think that's what's happening right now in America. So we're a kind of complicated um, uh, interaction
mm,
of multicultural and economic factors,
mm,
yeah, contributing to the breakdown of any pretense of a truly multicultural society. I don't want to
mm.
sound too pessimistic, but
Yeah,
we're not even making any pretense right now. We're
exactly.
reducing multicultural aspects of American culture and reducing them to ultimately being white and being Christian.
So thank you so much for the time.
Thank
Um,
you.
I'm really grateful for the audience. I mean, the perseverance through all the difficulties of getting here. Thank you so much. I hope that hopefully beginning of next year, I can actually get you down here, fund your trip and all, and actually get you down here to actually talk with Nigerian scholars.
I would love that. So
Uh,
thank you for talking, and you know how to find me.
yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. All right. Thank you, sir. Have a
Have a
great
good
day,
one.
sir. Yeah.
Bye now.
Bye.